Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event as part of the Cambridge Festival. My name's Julian Huppert. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College, and it's great to be able to put this and the other events that we have together for you. Thank you for joining us, whether you are here in person in the Frankopan Hall in Jesus College or you are online. We've had people from about 150 countries come to some of our events, and you never know, maybe we'll get a few more countries tonight. It's getting harder and harder to find them. Some of you know Jesus College extremely well. I see the master, I see a former vice master. Some of you may not have been here before. Jesus has an amazing history. We originally set up back in 1144 when a small group of itinerant nuns were given a little plot of land outside the tiny town of Cambridge. That was then extended by a gift from King Malcolm of Scotland. You may notice this isn't Scotland, and there's some more complexities to the story. And the nunnery flourished for hundreds of years. In 1496, the then Bishop of Ely came to see how things were going, and he reported that there were two nuns left. One of them was rather elderly, and the other was of ill fame, which you can interpret however you like for a young woman living alone near a university town. And so he toppled the nunnery and replaced it with an all-male college, something we have since fixed. And since 1496, we have educated and trained people who have gone on to change many things around the world, to rethink what's happening. We have people like Malthus, who was interested in population control. What happens if we breed more and more people? We don't have food to deal with them. We have people like Lisa Jardine, who was a brilliant English scholar, but also chair of the Human Fertilization Embryology Authority and awarded for her scientific work as well. More recently, we have people like Clean Bandit. Some of you may know Rockabye. Thank you. It's been listened to by, well over 1 billion times, and if you haven't yet, you really should do. They met here in this college. And for the last few years, the Intellectual Forum has tried to continue in the footsteps of these amazing people, getting people to think and talk about many of the biggest issues of our time. Last week, we had a massive global summit looking at responsible AI, something we were actually running an event on just a couple of hours ago. And today we're going to have one of our own to talk about storytelling and the importance of that. Véronique Mottier has been a fellow here since 1999, I believe, but has a background in many different places. She's currently also a professor in Switzerland. Just as Scotland is not here, Switzerland is not either. But as I think originally grew up in Tunisia and the Netherlands, she's won many prizes, done some fantastic research, is currently also taking on the very challenging role of leading our Legacy of Slavery Working Party, which may come up later. But today, she's going to talk about the power of storytelling and how it affects care survivors and what it means for reparative justice. Véronique, thank you for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Julian. Can you hear me well? Okay, so I'm going to talk about storytelling. And I'll start by saying that storytelling is something we all do all the time, right? It's one of the important ways in which we build our own identity. We tell stories about ourselves to others. And when events happen, a divorce or your dog dies, you change your story, right? You change the story about yourself. You change the way you think about yourself, the way you think about your past. Storytelling is also a very important device at the collective level. So as a country, as a nation, we tell stories about ourselves. We tell stories about our collective past. And those stories are competing with other stories. So there are many different versions of how we should best tell the story of our historic past. And in some occasions, those two come together. So the individual stories which people tell about themselves to others can serve, in some cases, to challenge those collective stories, to challenge the collective way in which a country sees itself, in which a nation sees its own identity. And in this particular project, which I'm going to talk to you about today, this is exactly what happens. So I'm going to talk about the way in which care survivors have used their personal storytelling, have used the telling of their own personal experiences in the care system as a way to challenge not just the care system or governmental policies, but also much more fundamentally the way a country sees itself and the way the country thinks of itself and thinks of the way in which it takes care of vulnerable groups in society. So this comes out of a project which I carried out with some very brilliant senior research associates, one of whom is with us today, Edmé Baïf, who is there. Thank you very much. Who's currently based at UCL London. Marina Hirschberg, who was at the time of the project is now finished, based at the University of Lausanne. And also some locals, so Simone Schneider, who's currently doing a PhD here at Jesus College, is helped with research assistance, and also Alex Paturel, who was one of my former BA students, also carried out some very important, produced some very important contributions to this project. So, in the context of this project, we were particularly interested in an older group, right? So we were interested in a group between 50 and 80 years old, so people who are now between 50 and 80 years old, and who had been placed in their childhood. Right? So they had been placed for the older category, so for the 80 years old, towards the 80 years old. That's the generation of my parents. They were placed between 80 and 60 years ago, right, as was the case for both of my parents. So one of my parents spent their entire childhood in 3 different orphanages. The other parents spent quite long stretches of time being put to work in farms, and that's a theme that I will explain a bit further later in the talk. Then towards the younger age group, towards the 50-year-olds, that's my age category. I also spent some time in the care system as a toddler, a much shorter amount of time, but it was in a children's home run by nuns, so it's quite funny that I ended up spending so much of my professional life in this former nunnery, as Julian just explained to us in his introduction. Now, before I go on, I should first make some clarifications about terminology, because words matter. And the words matter to the people we interview and to the people we research. So today in the UK, we tend to prefer, in policy speak, we tend to prefer terms like care leavers or care experienced or looked after children, right? And there are good reasons for that, and very laudable reasons for that, because we want people who have gone through the care system to feel less stigmatized and to feel that it's not necessarily an experience that destroys their life, right? So those terms have an important meaning and have an important motivation as well. In our research, we use the word care survivors because that's the way the people we study see themselves, right? We are not studying the entire group of people who were placed between the age and 50 who are currently between 50 and 80. We don't study this group as a whole. We're zooming in on one particular subgroup, and that is those people who went through the care system at some point in their life and who now became activists within the last decade, right? So that's a very small subgroup. Our research is that I will talk, the research that I will talk about today is particularly focused on the Swiss case, so I will talk about Switzerland. And in that group, that category of what we have called victim activists in our research, so people who were victims of the care system because they were often abused, they were often, there's reasons why they became activists. That group represents a couple of dozen of people, right? With the amount of people who were placed in those decades is estimated to several, from several tens of thousands of people to possibly 100,000. So estimates vary, but that's quite a large group that was placed. So what we're looking at is not the group as a whole, many of whom will have had very happy experiences and have had very positive trajectories ever since, but we're looking at this particular subgroup who are therefore much more likely to have had bad experiences. And I should also say, because I started with the personal comment, that this research is not on our own family, so none of the anonymized names that appear in the rest of my presentation is either me or any person from my family. Our experiences were partly in other countries as well. So first, some statistics. So why do we talk about care survivors? Well, because they really literally are. They literally are. They have, on average, for the man, 2.5 times more chance to have died in early adulthood. Right, so they die much earlier. For men and women together, it's about 1.5 times more than the general population. An important recent study that looked at a very sort of older age category of an average age of 71 reports that 74% in this category have experienced physical abuse, compared to 23% in the general population, and 58% declare having experienced sexual abuse, against 29% in the general population. Now, personally, I find that 29% quite high as well. Now, that actually reflects that in the older generation, sexual abuse was really widespread, and that by the time you get to 80, about 30% of people have experienced it, right, or declare having experienced it. In the care population, it's double. Now, of course, one way of reading these figures, you have to be careful with how you interpret these figures, because, of course, some of the children would have been placed because they were victims of abuse in the first place, right? So that doesn't mean that all of this happened during their time in care. However, here, remember, we're not looking at the entire group, we're just looking at the subgroup of activists. And in that subgroup of activists, the figures are, if anything, higher. So that's why they become activists, right? So they have experienced it in the care system, possibly also before, but also in the care system. And that's why they became activists later on. So that's sort of clarification about figures, but also about the term of survivors, right? So these are people who are aware, who have experienced in their flesh abuse, and who have seen it happen to others, and who have seen others who have not survived, literally. So in the Swiss case, what are we talking about when we're talking about these child placements? So during these 40 years, from the 1940s to 1980s, many children were placed in orphanages or children's homes. And here I should explain that orphanages are not full of orphans. Actually, most children in orphanages have at least one parent. So the term orphanage is not entirely correct, but that's the term that was often used in the past. They were also placed in farms to work for farmers as free labor. So these were seen as a sort of foster family arrangement, but they were often placed and exploited by the farmers for their free labor, and often also abused, including sexual abuse by the farmers, with very little oversight. So inspections were announced beforehand. They were usually not done in the presence of the child. And the typical situation of an inspection would be that there would be a conversation between the farmer's family and the inspection that had been announced beforehand, and then the child would be called in the last 2 minutes, right, in the presence of the farmers. So there was very little defense also against situations of abuse. Then a third category was placed in administrative detention, and that's a Swiss specificity. The other categories are not. Other countries, including the UK, also placed children in children's homes. Lots of children of the poor, working classes, were placed in children's homes in the same time period. Tens of thousands of children were sent overseas. So, for example, one example is the Fairbridge Farm Schools scheme in Australia, where many children from the UK were sent in order to work also on farms, etc. And they've just engaged in their own campaign for reparative justice, which has been on the whole very successful. So that's not something specific, but what was specific to Switzerland is this administrative detention, which was a very strange scheme whereby the state could place people in prison. These really were prisons. Sometimes they were presented as workhouses, but people were enclosed without any sort of legal process. And this was on the ground. Usually the terms that were used was protective custody, and justifications that were used could be something like because the person is work shy, so they would have to learn how to work, or often this was single mothers, women who became pregnant very young, again from working classes, and who could then be placed in this protective custody for an potentially unlimited amount of time. I mean, we will see some cases in the cases I will tell you about. And during that time, the child would be born and would be then taken away and put up for forced adoption. So that's what they mean with administrative detention. It was finished in the 1980s, but until then, this was quite a widespread practice without any sort of legal recourse on the part of the people who were placed. who were those children who were placed? Well, many of them were children of single mothers. So this was very much about the policing of female sexuality. So when women got pregnant out of wedlock, they were by definition seen as morally degenerate, morally defective, and therefore their children as well. So their children would be placed. There was also an important economic consideration. That is that in the Swiss system, if a woman did not have a source of income, which often is the case for very young mothers, then the state would have to step in, right? So the local authorities would have to pay benefits to the child. And that would be a very important motivation for local authorities to put children in care, because it was much cheaper. And here also the possibility to place them in farms and use them as free labor, of course, made it even cheaper, because that means there was no cost to the state, right? This was the farmers who would feed the children. So that was a very typical group and a very large group amongst these. A second very large group was the children of migrant workers. So from the 1930s and 1940s, tens of thousands of workers came, particularly from Italy, to work in the tunnel building and later in restaurants, in the hotel sector, in construction work as well in Switzerland. They were not allowed to bring their families, or if they were married, husband and wife could each come and work, but they were not allowed to live together. They had to live with their employers. So the employer had to sort of create accommodation for them. So as a result, many of these migrant workers who ended up getting married and having children placed their children in orphanages because they were not allowed to take care of them. And that's quite a large group. So that's a direct result of the way migrant workers were treated also until roughly the 1980s. And the third group is the Yenish, and I'm going to start with them because they're probably the group that started the earliest with making claims for reparation. It was also one of the groups that became visible the earliest. So I'll first tell you a little bit about the Yenish. Now, the Yenish are a group of nomadic people. So they're the equivalent of the Romas or the Roms. The Yenish travel, they're like travelers, so they travel around countries like Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, and a few others. So they're typically moving around, not sedentarized. Here's some photos of the 1920s. Nowadays, there are still about 30,000 Yenish in Switzerland, but of course, it's a transient moving population. So it's not always the same number. This is a group that was very, very early on targeted by racial scientists in Switzerland. So racial scientists who started creating race theories, as happened also in the UK from the late 19th century, started theorizing different groups of the population in racial terms and started seeing them as racially inferior or racially superior to each other. And the Yenish were one of these groups that in the Swiss context were theorized by these scientists, mostly psychiatrists, as a racial group, as racially distinctive and biologically inferior. They were theorized as inherently degenerate, morally degenerate. Work shy was a very common term. Stupid was a term that was often used also. They were often labeled stupid. They often labeled mentally retarded. The girls were labeled as prone to sexual excesses and immorality, and the boys were labeled as criminal. So we see all these racialized stereotypes emerging from the 1920s, and that's going to partly lead, it's not the only reason, but it's going to partly lead to a very notorious policy that happened from the 1920s, more precisely from 1926 until 1973, which is called the program of the children of the country lanes. So this is a program where the children were taken away from the Yenish families as early as possible, so often already as babies, but of course because they were traveling around, sometimes they would arrive and have somewhat older children, and the authorities would take the children away from the families and place them in children's homes, reformatory, sometimes used prisons, and also sometimes in farms. The first director for several decades was someone called Alfred Siegfried. Now, without entering too much into detail, I think his story is quite interesting. So he started out as a school teacher in Basel, and he was fired from his job and convicted in court for improper sexual relationships with a student. Right? So he was convicted of that. Who better to choose to put into place of such a program, right? So he ended up being put in charge of this program of child placement, where he personally would receive the new children who arrived. And this is actually a photo of him. I find it personally a very sinister photo, because he's leading the children away. And where is he leading them to? He's first leading them to his house. So the typical trajectory is that he would first keep them a couple of weeks or a couple of months in his own house, and only then would they be placed in the children's orphanages. Now, you will not be surprised to hear that in sort of recent oral history, where colleagues of mine have gathered the storytelling of the Danish children who were placed, who are now adults, that there are a lot of anecdotes of sexual abuse. So this is a policy that went on for many decades. And this is one of his quotes, but he said a lot more of these kind of things. Where he said, anyone who wants to fight successfully against vagrancy needs to break the travelers community. They need to, as harsh as that may sound, rip apart their families. Now, this was in 1942, and we all know what happened to the Danish and to the Sinti and to the Romas during the Second World War. So this also influenced the way Switzerland dealt with their own Danish community. They did not offer them shelter when they would try to flee the Holocaust. So in this context, one of the very early and very interesting activists, and this is the first case I want to tell you a little bit about, as an example of political storytelling, of storytelling that has helped to achieve change, is the story of Mariella Meer. So Mariella Meer is the person on this photo. She died last year, unfortunately. Her life story is not extreme in comparison to other Danish placed children, right? So her story is quite representative of what happened to these children. What we see is often accumulation of the different types of abuse, right? So what happens to her? Well, firstly, in her family, there were 3 generations of placed children. So in 1926, her mother, so this is when it starts, right? 1926, the policy program starts. So her mother is one of the first Danish children to be placed. Right? Then Mariella herself gets placed as a young child in 1947. She experiences 16 orphanages, 3 workhouses, so these were corrective institutions, like semi-prisons. She's also placed in several psychiatric clinics where she undergoes electroshocks, even as a young child. Her 12-year-old brother, who was placed at the same time, ends up killing himself at the age of 12 in one of these institutions. So by the time she gets to the age of 18, she deliberately gets pregnant because she thinks it's her way out. She hopes that if she falls pregnant, that they will have to let her go because her partner wants to be with her and they have a baby. But actually, that's not what happened. She gets placed in this women's prison, the Hindelbank women's prison. Other people that we've studied in our research were also placed there, and that's typically this case of the pregnant young woman who gets placed under the guise of administrative detention, so in protective custody. In her case, it was justified exactly by the usual stereotypes that she was work shy, so she needed to learn how to work, which is what they did in this women's prison. They made the women work, and that she was lascivious, as proven by the fact that she got pregnant out of wedlock. So she stays 19 months in this prison. Then her child is born and taken away from her, and she herself is sterilized against her will. So this is quite a typical story, right? So this is quite a typical story. Now, Mariella Meer is someone who, from an early age onwards, had a lot of rage and a lot of energy. So it's someone whose whole life has been a life of resistance, even from her early childhood onward. Very shortly after she's released from from the prison, she comes across a PhD thesis, which is written by one of the psychiatrists who had studied her. Right, so he writes an entire analysis of her family actually, and also of herself. So she comes across these kind of quotes where they label her, right? So this is one of the examples, but there's a lot more, not just about her, but also about the rest of her family. So, for example, he writes, she's a disturbed, unstable, needy psychopath, morally degenerate, with neurotic traits and a strong tendency to overestimate herself, as is proven by her desire to become a writer. Right. So even in the mid-80s, I mean, this was in 67, and it's in 67 that she reads it. It's a year after she's released from the prison. But when she writes to her then future husband, she says, I hate him, I hate him, I hate him. I almost suffocate on my hatred. How will I ever rid myself of this hatred? They were the mad ones, not I. Right? So she's revolting against this labeling that's being imposed on her. Right? She's being labeled as mad, she's been labeled as unstable, as psychopathic. These are all the racial categories, by the way. These are psychiatric categories, but they were used in the context of these racial theories, right? In the sense that groups that were presented as racially inferior, amongst which the Yenis were placed, were also seen as more prone to mental illnesses. The same for the Jews, by the way. So Jewish people were also, by some Swiss psychiatrists, theorized as more easily prone to schizophrenia, what we call nowadays bipolar conditions, etc. So these psychiatric labels get completely intertwined with the racial labels, right, and with the racial hierarchies that are being established by these doctors, and that still echo well into the 60s. Right? They are created in the 1920s and 1930s with respect to the Yenish. But even in the 60s, you see the same words used, you see the same arguments used. So her revenge, so to speak, is that she becomes a very, very successful author, and it's quite an astonishing life story, actually. She becomes a very well-known poet, playwright, novelist. She founds the International Romany Writers Association. For a while, she's also the vice president of it. In 1998, she receives a honorary doctorate of the University of Basel for her literary oeuvre, but also for her defense of minorities. And there's some irony in that, because it was actually the University of Basel that was in the 1920s one of the main hotbeds from which these racial theories about the Yenis were being constructed, right? So there's sort of an extra irony to the fact that it's that university that now honors her in the late 1990s. Now she publishes many books, a lot of poetry, but her first book, Stone Age, is the most autobiographical. So in this one, she really, it's presented as a novel, but it really is very much about her own experiences. And here she talks back at the psychiatrist, right? So the people who labeled her whole childhood. So she says, I want to live, you understand, despite the prediction that you made about me 30 years ago. I want to live, nothing else. That's what she writes here in the figure, through the figure of Sylvia. Actually, in the book, she takes on 3 different names and 3 different personas, also to reflect this fragmentation that she experiences as part of her trajectory in her childhood. So this is one of the examples. This book became a bestseller in Switzerland. It made it was a big shock when it came out. It received a lot of attention, a lot of prizes as well. And this is one of the examples of this storytelling, where here in the form where literary works can serve to create a debate. In this case, this helped to intensify the debate around the Yenish, which had already started in the 1970s. So this is one example of storytelling in a literary format, which participated in this critical challenge to the self-image of Switzerland as a country in which psychiatry is one of the master disciplines that we can all be proud of, with the big pharmaceutical industry as well, and in the belief in the objectivity of psychiatric labeling, right? By showing how these labels were used to repress a particular racialized group. So she doesn't only use storytelling, she also used other, she becomes a very active Yenish activist. And there's one example of that which I just wanted to show you, which has become an iconic photo. So this is at the moment at Pro Juventude, which was the organization which managed the Yenish child placements and which was closed down. This particular branch of, the program of Yenish placements was closed down in the early 1970s after a huge public outcry, but Pro Juventute still existed. So in 1986, there's a press conference by Pro Juventute, and you can imagine what she's looking at here is a long table with the great and the good, because in these kind of foundations, Pro Juventute is a much wider organization. It's the organization it's one of the main organizations that is meant to defend children, right? So that's meant to defend the interests of children. So it usually always has a former government minister on its council, sitting on its council, and he's sitting there, right? So one of the former government ministers is sitting there at the table. So in this photo, Marielle Meer, who's the woman who's pointing, all the men around her are Yenish. So they gate crash the conference, the press conference, and she starts haranguing them. She starts pointing at them and saying, "You should apologize for what you've done to us." And it's a very important political moment. It made a very big impression. But actually, a year later, no, actually less, a month later, the then Swiss president, Alphonse Egli, does make an official apology, right? And this is not only in reaction to this particular press conference, but to the whole sort of combination between storytelling, more and more victims of these programs who make their voices heard, who tell their experiences, who get attention in the press, and this really creates a huge sort of public debate about this. So an organization of Yenish people is founded, called the Nashad Yenische, who are asked to put into place individual monetary compensations, reparations, which the government pays for, but which are actually insultingly low. So the cost, the amounts are between 2,000 and 20,000 Swiss francs. Now today the Swiss franc is plummeting by the hour, but if you look at the lower amount, 2,000 francs, that's about, I haven't looked at the last hour, but it's about 1,800 pounds, right? 1,800 pounds compensation for a child who destroyed. The category of people who get the highest amount is a little bit over 300. So only about 300 people got sort of the highest category of compensation. That's still only about 18,000 or 16,000 pounds. So what they do get, and which is much more important to them at that moment, is the access to administrative files. Now, this may seem like something trivial, but the administrative files, that's where their identity is. Because at the moment that they're placed, often their names are changed. They do not know their names, especially those who were placed as children, as babies. So when they grow up in the children's homes, they often don't even know their Yenish, right? So it's only when these files are opened that many of these placed children, as adults, find out that they were Yenish. And that they also find out that their parents are still alive, because often the parents were told that the children had died, and the children were told that the parents had died. The parents were encouraged to write letters to the children. They said, you can write letters. They will not be allowed to reply, but you can write. And in good bureaucratic fashion, when some of my colleagues who did a huge research project on this in the 1990s went to look into the state archives, they found all those letters perfectly, beautifully filed away, unopened. So they were never delivered. The children never got to read them. And the children thought they were orphans, right? So the access to the administrative files is very important because it's where they find their names, it's where they find their life histories, and it's where they can sometimes find their parents if they're still alive. Now, another story which I want to tell you about, another example of storytelling, is much more recent. So in the last 10 years, there's been an intensifying of a public debate on a much bigger group of placed children. So one could say that the first public debate was about the Yenish. That happened from the 1970s. Then it died down a bit. The public lost interest. But in the last 10 years, there's been a major public debate on the many tens of thousands of children from the working classes who were placed, right? From the working classes more generally. So that includes, of course, Yenish, but not only. And here I'm going to just talk about one example of storytelling by someone called Sergio Di Vecchi. It's one example amongst many others. So many of these, amongst the activists that we've studied, ended up producing books. So either they wrote them themselves, Or in the case of those who had very little education, which was the case of many of them, they had ghostwriters who wrote their life stories for them. But there is this sort of new genre since about 10, 15 years of a couple of dozens of books that have come out where people tell their story of their experiences, their bad experiences in the care system, that they had 50, 60 years earlier, right? Now, the case of De Vecchi is also quite fascinating. So he spends his entire childhood in care. He's placed as a baby. Typical situation. His mother was unmarried. She was a young woman living in a very Catholic province, the province of Ticino, which is an Italian-speaking province. She was not married to the father of her baby, and the father, little by little, disappears anyway of the story. So little Sergio is placed. He spends his entire life in the care system. So far, so formulaic. It's a story of many, many tens of thousands of children in the Swiss situation. And where his story becomes different is that as an adult, he starts working in social services. So he starts working in the care system, and he works his way up to becoming the director of a children's home. So he ends up working as a director of a children's home. He also ends up as the president of a national association that's in charge of pedagogic reform in the care system. So he becomes a very well-known public figure and works for decades in this sector. He never mentions to anyone what happened in his childhood. He's never mentioned it. So until he wrote the book. So actually not quite until he wrote the book. I'll first tell you what he does. So in the book called Heimweh, so that's homesick, with of course also the wordplay on homesick. In the book he writes, "Why did I remain silent for so long? There's no simple answer to that. There's a deep shame of children from children's homes. There's the internalization of guilt. For many years I was given to understand that as a child born out of wedlock, I was worth less than others. As a child, I became more and more convinced that my placement in the children's homes was my own fault. Later, I saw my own childhood and my own youth as inferior. I worried that disclosing it would harm my professional career. It would be incorrect to say that I did not want to speak about it. I simply couldn't. The inner wall of shame and silence held up. I wanted to take the truth with me to my grave." Right? Now, De Vecchi is one of the many people who first revealed in public their experiences after the public debate started, right? So from 2009, 2010, there's a series of exhibitions that tour Switzerland on this theme. Historians start publish more and more works on this. The press takes an interest. Several of the activists that we ended up interviewing intervene in the press and give interviews about their experiences. There's some documentaries. And he's watching all of this. And he's thinking, I cannot stay silent anymore. So that's when he decides to go public. And he chooses the day of his retirement. So on the day of his retirement, he gives a big retirement event where he has a PowerPoint. So on the PowerPoint, he talks about his career. He talks about his pedagogic idea. And the very last slide is a slide of him as a small child in the children's home. And he finishes with that slide. And none of his colleagues ever reacted to that. Nobody commented on that. And that was a real shock to him because it actually showed that he probably was right not to mention it before. He probably would have been stigmatized. It probably would have harmed his career. And it also shows that the silence is still there. The wall of silence is still there. So the storytelling is important because people like him are now telling their stories, and that is helping to break up the national silence. But there's also still a lot of resistance. For a long time, people didn't know. Nowadays, we kind of know, but not everybody wants to know, right? And I think that's really what his personal experiences shows, that his colleagues did not want to know. And this also made me think about the costs of storytelling, right? So in the therapeutic model, telling your experiences to your therapist or more in public is meant to be liberating, right? It's meant to be positive. It's meant to be good for you. It's meant to lead to a happy end, right? In fact, almost every single victim activist that we interviewed had paid quite a cost for their going public. The only exceptions, or the ones who didn't see it that way, were the Yenish activists, and I think it's because they'd seen it all before. You know, they'd been activists since the 1970s, so they were very unfazed by pushback, by hostile reactions, by silence, by refusal to hear. But the ones for whom it was new were deeply hurt by it. So this is one example. Here the names are fictitious. In the other occasions, I didn't anonymize them because they themselves have signed their books, so they're well known. There's no point in anonymizing them. So in this case, an anonymized person who's one of our victim activists that we studied, she says, it's not me who betrayed the nation. This country has betrayed thousands of young and less young working class people. But I was subjected to more and more bullying from my entourage. And that was very, very hard. I came to be more and more excluded, ever more. Right, so here she's also talking about her work colleagues. She worked for the UN at the time. People stopped talking to her, stopped taking a break with her, stopped inviting her for drinks after work, etc. Another case, that of Gabriel, he says, today I'm lucky to have received a lot of media attention. That's something. But it's sad to be a well-known person because of the misery that happened. Right? So in his case, he was placed in children's homes and was the victim of very, very serious physical abuse. And he writes about that, so that was in the public domain. So here he says, I feel ashamed. You understand? Sometimes I feel ashamed. And here we find, again, that sort of internalization of the societal gaze, right? Of this labeling, of the way they've been labeled all their lives. It's still there, right? It's very hard not to feel ashamed when you've been taught you should feel ashamed for being poor or for being the child of a single mother in the 1950s, etc. Actually, in our research, we had many similar anecdotes. Personally, the one I found almost the most sad was one man who said he lived on his own, so he's a single man, and he lived in a little flat in a building with lots of little apartments. All the other apartments had families in them, and he said, "Oh, it used to be really nice because when the families would have barbecues, they would always invite me in summer, and we had a good time together." But since I was interviewed in the local paper, so he had published quite a bit nationally. But in the local paper, they ran a one-page interview with him. And he said, since my interview in the local paper appeared, which told his story, I never get invited anymore. So he lost the little social circle that he had built up. And another more extreme case is somebody who told me that somebody had been placed with their brother, and their brother had just published a book about where he tells his experiences of having been abused by a Catholic priest. And he said that the day the book came out, he left his flat, so the brother leaves his flat, and the neighbor calls him scum. Right? He doesn't call him scum for having been sexually abused, he calls him scum for having told it. Right? So that's also, it shows the pushback, right? It's also part of the cost of storytelling. All of our activists would still do it again, right? So the fact that they've experienced a cost to it doesn't mean they regret it. They see it invariably as a moral task. So Anna, for example, says, I've never regretted it. I would do it again. But I didn't expect this, right? And when she says this, she's referring to the 7 years of bullying by her work colleagues. And I also didn't expect that in 2018, so this is years after she's published her book about herself, I would still be checking the headlines in the newspapers. Right? Then she says, we were the pioneer victims. It's important that we build a bridge to the current generation. The current generation needs to realize, these freedoms that we have today, they didn't simply fall from the sky. First, taboos had to be shattered. There were many victims. The freedoms of today had to be fought for hard, right? So there's this sort of idea that storytelling is a duty, right? It will cost them, and they now know that, and they didn't expect it, and they're still shocked by it, but they would do it again. Mariella Meer says the same. She says they did it. They have thousands, such as me, on their conscience. Only a few overcame it. Most of them didn't make it. So she's talking about the Yenish children. Most of them didn't make it. They were destroyed. They were dehumanized. I still remember the names of many of them. I remember their appearance as young children, young girls, women. it's for them that I write this play. So she ends up writing a play on the program Kinder der Landstraße, of the children of the country lanes, which also made a big contribution to the public debate. So it's for them, for those who are no longer there, right, that I write this play, for them and for Christian. Christian was her child who had been taken, her baby who had been taken away from her. They later reunite, by the way. Now, that's not to say that storytelling is enough, right? So the storytelling was important. It was important that these couple of dozens of people amongst the tens of thousands of victims of forced placements spoke out, right? The large majority chose to stay silent or couldn't speak, right? It wasn't able to do it. It was very important that this small group did this, that they were able to produce their public storytelling, because it did break up the silence, even though there was resistance towards doing so. But storytelling alone doesn't change a system, right? So storytelling is the necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition for political change, for actual institutional change. So here I want to briefly mention a third life story, that of Guido Fleury. So Guido Fleury is also, again, a very interesting figure, very well known, so not anonymized here. He's very successful. He's on the younger side of the age category, as you can see. Very successful businessman, made a fortune as a businessman, so he became a multimillionaire. He spent his entire childhood in and out of care. His mother was unmarried, and she also suffered from schizophrenia. So he had this exact similar background to that of many, many other children who had been placed in care. Now, he's a man of action, so the details I've just told you is about all we know about him in terms of his personal story, right? He has not written a biography, he has not let someone write a biography so far of him. He doesn't seem very keen to tell us more, right? So we don't really know what he experienced in the system. What we do know is his action. So he's somebody who does things and who undertakes political activities. By this, I should actually correct it and say that storytelling itself is also a political activity. But it's in his case, it's sort of more institutional activities. So the first thing he does, or one of the first things he does, is he buys his former children's home. So that's the Moemlieswil, the building on the left, is his former children's home. Now, he actually buys it up and he turns it into a museum which memorializes the experiences of these placed children, right? So on the right, you've got the photos in the corridors of this children's home, which then became a museum, and where he also has a monument in recognition of the suffering of many of these placed children. So that's one of the first things he does. Another thing he does is he goes and sees the Pope with two Swiss victims of sexual abuse by Catholic priest. And in that audience, in that conversation, the Pope makes a formal apology on behalf of the Catholic Church for the abuse that has been administered in Catholic institutions in Switzerland. It wasn't only Catholic institutions, but they played an important role also with respect to the Jenisch, by the way. So then another very important activity that he undertakes, he's not the only one, of course, but he uses the political system very cleverly. So Switzerland has a direct democracy system. So concretely that means that if you can get 100,000 signatures on any topic at all, you can force the government to call for a vote. Right? So you need 100,000 signatures, and then you can get the whole country to vote on it. Now, it's not that easy to get 100,000 signatures. It's actually very costly. It usually takes a long time, and many committees who try to get to collect enough signatures don't actually manage. So he proposes to call a vote on an initiative which he calls the reparation initiative, where the aim is to produce some financial reparation for the victims, and also quite a few other points, such as he wants there to be scientific research on the topic, etc. So this is actually a much longer story, so I won't have time to tell you about the whole political process. It's more complicated than that. But he manages to get the 100,000 signatures together in record time. To cut a more complicated story short, the Swiss here in the room know it's more complicated, but to cut a more complicated story short, in the end, the Swiss government avoids the vote by putting in place a certain number, by responding to a certain number of the demands. And very concretely, they provide some financial reparation, but contrary to the Danish case, and contrary also to the Australian case, by the way, this financial reparation does not vary according to the degree of suffering, right? So for example, in the Australian case, you actually have to go and say, how many times were you raped, right? And if it was 5 times, you get more than if it was 2 times. So you imagine what that puts the people through. And also this takes years. And meanwhile, these people are dying. They're dying of old age and of illness. So in the Swiss case, the government decided a blanket amount, which is low, considering that for many of these people, they were denied education, they often suffered from severe trauma, but it was a blanket amount in order to be able to go fast. They also provide access to files, scientific research. There was a formal apology by in the name of the Swiss government in 2013. And one could say that the silence has been broken, right? Even though not everybody wants to hear, but there's now many exhibitions, school materials, etc. on this topic. And I'll finish on some reflections on the limits of this process. So the way the victims experienced that was somewhat ambivalent, right? So firstly, particularly the acknowledgement, the public acknowledgement of what happened, the fact that this was now common knowledge and that it was talked about in public, that was, in the eyes of the victim activists, one of their main achievements, right? So this was a really important achievement, as was the apology, right? And that actually, to me, came as a surprise because there is ambivalence about the material compensation, right? Which is also not presented as compensation, because then it should be much more. So it's presented as a solidarity contribution. So the relatively low amount of this solidarity contribution is contested by some of these victim activists. So I was expecting that they might be quite cynical about the apology. I thought maybe they'll say, well, yeah, well, we got the apology, but we're not getting any sort of real material compensation for everything we've lost throughout our lives. And in fact, that's not at all what we found. I mean, we found that for absolutely all of the victim activists, the moment of the national ceremony when the government of Switzerland stood up and said, we apologize for what we have done, they all found it deeply moving. And it was a very genuine moment for them. So there was no cynicism about this whatsoever. It didn't mean they were not critical about some of the other elements of the reparative process, but the apology was very important. The limit which they felt sort of subjectively was that ultimately, of course, the whole campaign was called a campaign for reparation, right? In German, that's Wiedergutmachung. Literally, that means we make it good again, right? That's also a very unfortunate term. So particularly the German-speaking activists that we interviewed, they said, well, you can't make it good again, right? You can never completely repair. So like one of our victim activists puts it, she says, reparation is impossible. How do you want to transform an injustice into a justice? So it's sort of the way it's emotionally experienced as a process which is impossible to reach an end point, right? That's not to say that you shouldn't try to get close to it, right? That's not to say that therefore you shouldn't be doing any of this, that you shouldn't be making apologies or providing services or support for the victims. So that's a sort of a point in terms of the way they personally experience it. Another point, and I will finish on that, is that every process of reparative justice can potentially create new injustices, right? So the storytelling was very important, but not all stories were heard to the same extent, right? Some stories were not heard. Some stories did not get much media attention. Some personal experiences were very little debated. The public apology from the Swiss government was for children who had been placed in farms. It was for children who had been placed in orphanages. It was for people who had been placed in administrative internment. It was also for people who had been incarcerated in psychiatric clinics. We've seen, for example, the case of Mariella Meer that often went together, right? For example, with the Yenis, but also with other placed categories. In psychiatric care, between quote marks, they were also used for psychiatric experiments, right? In particular for drug experience, medical experience. And it's very, very striking how little attention there's been in the public debate on that category of victims. There's been very little sympathy for them, very little attention paid to them. And one can only explain that by saying, well, these are categories that are still stigmatized. Right? There are still, psychiatric patients are still stigmatized to this day. So therefore, in the hierarchy between good and bad victims, they're on the bad side. Right? The good victims are the young Swiss children who were ripped away from their mothers and put to work in the farms, right? They get a lot of sympathy, and they should, I'm not criticizing that. But those who were in psychiatric clinics and who were used to experiment on are seen as, but they're crazy anyway, so they're not seen as deserving victims. The same for the women who were victims of coerced sterilizations, and that has to do with the way their sexuality was portrayed, right? So there were usually single mothers. Most victims of coerced sterilizations in Switzerland were single unmarried mothers, so they were seen as well, but they had loose lives, right? They had an immoral lifestyle. They were nymphomaniacs. That was a term that was often used still in the 50s and 60s. So therefore, they're also not in the category of deserving victims, right? They also got a lot less attention and a lot less media audiences. And finally, the group that has been very, very little debated as well is the children of migrant workers. Now, that group is very interesting as well, because it was actually about half of the children who were placed were the children of migrant workers. So in terms of numbers, it was big. These were a lot of children from migrant origins who were placed in these conditions. That, of course, again reflects the wider power relations which still exist today, and which also portray the rights of migrants as less important and less deserving of recognition than the rights of the sort of true Swiss, between quote marks, right? And I'll finish on that. That every process of reparative justice can potentially create new injustices, but also new demands for reparative justice. So actually, just a few months ago, a group of children who had been placed as children of migrant workers got together and created a campaign for reparation for themselves. Right? So it will be very, very interesting how they fare. I'm expecting them to get a lot less political support than the wider categories. But I would love to be wrong. I will finish on that.
Thank you very much, Véronique. That was brilliant, chilling, terrifying. When you think about the lives lost or the potential squandered. You've also told a story largely about Switzerland, but it's not just Switzerland, of course. There are similar stories in too many places around the world.
Absolutely. Yes.
Many other things I could talk about, but we do have time for questions from everyone else here. Or if you're online, please use the Q&A feature. If there are any questions in the room, I'll start with those. There's one just over here.
First of all, thank you very much. That was very informative on the subject I know very little about. You focused on Switzerland as, I don't know why, but I was curious, with all that focus, we've not heard these types of stories or reparative justice or anything like that in this country, or in my knowledge, many other Western countries. Is that because it was particularly bad in Switzerland, or it is now particularly good in Switzerland, that we're getting the message out and that they're actually thinking about it? Like, which is it? Is it that we were all equally bad in the 40s to 80s and Switzerland's better now? Or or what? I was just curious.
It's a very good question. I think you're completely right that there have been campaigns for reparative justice that have also very much concerned the UK, and they're extremely recent. So I quickly mentioned the Fairbridge farm scheme, where children from the UK were sent to Australia, and that's been happening this last decade. So actually, very recently. So they've had a series of, court cases. It was a program that was scattered in different places in Australia. So one of the settlements has already gone to trial, and people have received compensation, which is 5 times more than in the Swiss case. Another one, and that's why I'm talking about that, because I'm getting back to the UK. In another case, the claims for monetary compensation were made towards the UK, and particularly towards the Prince's Trust. And that's been just turned down quite recently. And I've seen very little in the press about it. So I don't really know whether, I cannot really answer your question as to whether the current situation is better or not. I have seen a recent study about conditions of children in care in the UK, which seems to say that conditions are deteriorating, that health outcomes are deteriorating in the UK. But that's the recent generation. If you look at this older generation, then what's different with respect to Switzerland is this idea of that the exportation towards abroad. And I'm wondering that if you export, the placed children, they were not just exported there.